So this video is to replace our live class that we typically would have. We're going to work through lesson 5.5, the home front. And your assignment is to read chapter 18, section 3 in your book, and then complete an activity. So this PowerPoint here will cover the information from chapter 18, section 3. As always, I recommend you skim over that section as well. That section is on the home front. So the main idea here is that the U.S. mobilized a variety of resources to wage World War I. So going into war is extremely expensive, and President Wilson needed to find ways to pay for that war. So one of those ways, taxes. Congress passed the War Revenue Act of 1917, which established very high taxes. It taxed the wealthy Americans up to 77% of their incomes, which is a whole lot. That is a lot of money on taxes. Additionally, it increased federal revenue by 400% within 2 years. So this money was necessary for waging the war, but again, it came at a cost because it did affect a lot of people. So another way were from loans and Liberty bonds. Wilson sparked an intense campaign to sell Liberty bonds, and that's a form of loan to the government from the American people. So basically what happens is you would buy a bond, a Liberty bond, and for a certain amount of money, and then the government would pay you back at a certain time. The idea there is like that, just like I said, you were giving a loan to the government and they would pay you back. And this was extremely helpful as well. The national debt grew from 1.2 billion to 25.5 billion in 3 years. So this help was extremely important. The U.S. government was spending a lot of money, so that is a lot of debt that the government went into. So this is why these things were so important. And additionally, another way to pay was regulating industry. So Congress created administrative boards to prepare industries for war. The War Industries Board regulated all war materials, and it increased production by 20%. There's a nice picture of a Liberty bond, a kind of advertisement for that. So in addition to kind of raising revenue, another thing that needed to be done was regulating supplies in the United States for troops, United States troops, and for Allied troops as well. So Congress passed the Lever Food and Fuel Control Acts, and this let government set prices and establish production controls. Herbert Hoover's Food Administration additionally promised farmers higher prices for crops. It also asked Americans to eat less and to plant food gardens to help to conserve and then therefore, give more food and things to the troops. Additionally, there was prohibition where alcohol is made using food crops like grapes and wheat. So prohibition, of course, was the restriction on drinking alcohol and creating alcohol. So these food crops, like grapes and wheat, that at times were going to making alcohol, were now just going to food production and food distribution instead. The 1919 Volstead Act passed prohibition as the temperance movement gained strength. So again, prohibition important there for regulating food supply. And additionally, there was regulation on fuel as well. You need a lot of fuel to supply an army. The Fuel Administration was established to set production goals and prices for fuel. Harry Garfield, who was the son of former President James A. Garfield, headed this administration, and he introduced daylight savings time to extend daylight hours for factory workers with long shifts. That's something we just saw come to an end here a few days ago. It also promoted fuel conservation by encouraging Americans to go without gas and heat on certain days. Here is some propaganda to encourage Americans to eat more of certain types of food and less of other types of food for the Army. Again, same thing with sugar and some more propaganda there to try and get Americans to eat less of certain things. So during the war, the profits of major industry companies skyrocketed because the companies were selling these things to the federal government in order to supply for the troops and things that would support the war. It created enormous profits for stockholders of industries like steel, oil, and chemicals. These things are used to build things like ships and oil to heat and to use for fuel and things like that. So these stockholders are making large amounts of money. Factory wages also increased, but the rising cost of food and housing meant that workers weren't much better off. So these stockholders are making lots of money and doing well, workers not so much. War demands also led to laborers working long hours in increasingly dangerous conditions in order to produce the needed materials on time and faster than other companies. So these companies are competing with one another to get these really, really good, these good deals from the government. So they want to be the ones to sell their goods to the government. So they're putting it on their workers to make sure that they're able to produce. And the harsher conditions led to many workers to join labor unions. During this time, union membership increased by about 60%, and unions boomed as well. More than 6,000 strikes were held during the war. Here is a picture of some wartime workers. The National War Labor Board leaders feared strikes would disrupt production for war efforts, so the Wilson administration created the National War Labor Board in 1918. And the board judged disputes between workers and management, so kind of acting like a middleman, and handled 1,200 cases during the war years. Also, to improve working conditions, it established an 8-hour workday and sought companies to recognize unions and urged equal pay for women. So this is something we actually talked about already when we talked about working conditions. So now you're seeing why this was such an important thing, because this is during the war. These people need to be working for our country. So like I said, some pictures of some women workers, some wartime workers. As men left for their jobs to fight in Europe, women moved in to keep the American economy moving. Women took many jobs traditionally held by men, doing things like working on the railroads, in factories, on docks, building ships and airplanes. Other women filled more traditional jobs, doing things like teaching, nursing, and volunteer work. About 1 million women joined the workforce during the war, and women use this as leverage for suffrage movement. So saying, hey, we are really making a difference here in the workforce, so we do deserve equal rights. We deserve the right to vote. We are doing these things for our country. Here's a cool picture of some women riveters posing for the camera in the Navy Yard at Puget Sound, Washington. So this is, you probably have seen the famous Rosie the Riveter. These are real riveters actually taking a break from their work. So a really cool picture there. Influenza. 3 waves of really severe flu strains broke out between 1918 and 1919 in Europe and in America. Of all American troops who died in World War II, half died from influenza. On the Western Front, crowded and unsanitary trenches helped for flu to spread among the troops, and then to American military camps in Kansas, and then beyond from there. The strain of influenza was deadly, killing healthy people within days. And during the month of October 1918, Influenza killed nearly 200,000 Americans. So people were very reasonably scared. Panicked city leaders halted gatherings. People accused the Germans of releasing flu germs into the population. It was a scary time. By the time it passed, over 600,000 Americans lost their lives from the flu. President Wilson used a number of tactics to gain support of Americans who favored neutrality in World War I. One way he did this was propaganda. The Committee on Public Information appointed reporter and reformer George Creel as its leader, and he began a campaign of propaganda with posters, news stories, speeches, and other materials to influence opinion. He hired movie stars to speak and artists to create patriotic posters and pamphlets. One famous poster you probably have seen before by James Montgomery Flagg pictures Uncle Sam saying, "I want you for the U.S. Army." The reactions to this, some Americans did begin to distrust German things. Many schools stopped teaching German and symphonies stopped playing German music. German-sounding names were changed, so sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage and hamburgers became Liberty steak. There were reports spread that German secret agents were operating in the U.S., which caused some Americans to discriminate against German Americans. There was also an effort to limit anti-war speech. So some Americans spoke out. We talked a lot about Jane Addams earlier in the year. She founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And Wilson's administration tried to limit war speech as well. Their Congress passed the Espionage Act, which punished people for aiding the enemy or refusing military duty. The year after this, it passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal for Americans to criticize the government, flag, military in speech or writing. More than 1,000 opponents of war were jailed under those acts, including Robert Goldstein, who directed a film called The Spirit of 76 and refused to remove scenes of British brutality during the American Revolution. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for criticizing the Espionage Act, but was later released after the war. And finally, many Americans thought that these acts violated the First Amendment, but others thought that they were essential to protect military secrets and the safety of America. This was a time of, people were scared. So the Supreme Court struggled to interpret the acts as well. In one case, Charles Scheck, an official of the American Socialist Party, organized the printing of 15,000 leaflets opposing the war and was convicted of violating the Espionage Act. He challenged the conviction in the Supreme Court, but the court upheld his conviction, which limited free speech during the war. People saw this and took note. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the court's unanimous decision, stating that some things said safely in peacetime are dangerous to the country during wartime. The next thing you have to do for this lesson is in step 2, the website activity. So if you click on this website, this is what you see here. So the documents below are going to do match each other in one of these 9 areas, and it's part of the propaganda techniques that we talked about in this section. So you can open up, if you click in the bottom right hand corner, it opens it up a little bit bigger, and you can see these documents and things a little bit bigger, so you can just click on them and match it just like you would a matching game. And then the last thing for you to do is the home front Padlet. So read the question here and answer the question by just double clicking and beginning to type. Don't forget to put the title as your name and then answer all of the questions in the space below. So that's your assignment for today. If you have any questions, just let me know.